The chamber was full, every seat taken, every delegation present. 412 representatives of the Galactic Conclave, arranged in tiered rows that curved like the inside of a shell, all facing the central dais where the motion had been placed on record since the morning session. The Human Integration and Labor Codification Act. 47 humans sat in the observer gallery above. Diplomats, aides, a few retired officers who had spent their careers in these halls. Councillor Marin Doss sat at the end of the third row, her hands folded on the railing, her face doing nothing. The debate had been running for 6 hours. It was not much of a debate. Delegate Veth Oran of the Karathi Sovereignty spoke for 20 minutes about economic efficiency, about resource allocation, about the documented productivity rates of human workers across 14 star systems, and the logical conclusion that formal administrative oversight would benefit the collective whole. He used charts. He used the word times integration, times 11, times and the word times enslavement times 0 times, which was a kind of achievement. The Shivan Compact's Elder Koth requested the floor. The chamber gave it, reluctantly. Koth was old enough that the translation device implanted in his jaw clicked audibly when he spoke. He stood at the speaker's post and looked at the room for a long moment before saying anything. "You are making a mistake," he said. "Not a political mistake, not a strategic one, a foundational one. You are voting to own something you do not understand and cannot replace." He paused. "When it breaks free, and it will break free, you will not recognize the shape of what comes for you." The chamber was polite about it. There was no jeering. Just the quiet, efficient sound of 400 assembled minds that had already decided, waiting for one old voice to finish. Koth returned to his seat. The floor was opened for final statements. Councillor Marin Doss stood. She was not a tall woman. She did not raise her voice. She held no notes, because she had not prepared any. What she was about to say did not require preparation. "We built your corridors," she said. "We ran your systems. We kept your lights on for 40 years without being asked to, and without asking for credit." She looked at the room. "Remember that you had a choice today." She sat down. 3 sentences. That was all. Veth Oran, watching from his delegation's tier, thought it was a strange farewell, emotional, understandable, given the circumstances, but ultimately the kind of thing people said when they had lost and needed to say something. He made a note to have his staff draft a humane implementation schedule. There was no reason this had to be difficult. The motion was called. The voting terminals lit up across the chamber, one by one. 94 delegations, 94 yes votes, each one registering in the central column above the dais. Green light stacking on green light, a clean and orderly cascade. 3 red lights. The Shivan Compact. Overruled and recorded. The presiding officer sealed the vote. The Human Integration and Labor Codification Act passes with supermajority confirmation. Humans are hereby reclassified under collective galactic administration as a managed species, effective. The gallery doors opened. All 47 humans stood at the same moment. No signal that anyone saw. No word exchanged. They simply rose, collected their materials, tablets, bags, the small personal items people carry to long sessions, and walked toward the exit in a single quiet file. No raised voices. No tears. No backward glances. The last one through was Marin Doss. She did not look at the chamber. She did not look at Veth Oran, though he was watching her. She walked through the doors, and they closed behind her with a sound, like a held breath releasing. The presiding officer finished reading the effective date into the record. The chamber began to applaud. Veth Oran clapped with the rest of them. He was smiling. It had been a good session, clean and decisive, the kind of legislative work that made careers. He would attend the dinner tonight and accept the congratulations of his peers, and think about the implementation schedule and the favorable trade position the Karathi Sovereignty had just secured. But the sound of those doors stayed with him. Not a slam. Not a protest. Just a door closing. He looked at the empty gallery for a moment. 47 chairs, materials cleared away, surfaces clean, as if the humans had never been there at all. Elder Koth was not applauding. Koth was looking at the gallery too. And his expression was the one old creatures wear when they have said the thing that needed to be said and were not heard, and have now accepted the cost of that. Vethoran looked away. Around him the celebration was building. Other delegates crossed the floor to shake hands. The presiding officer was already drafting the formal announcement. Someone had ordered food brought to the chamber, a tradition, after major votes. The lights in the chamber were warm and gold. They were human-built lights, running on human-designed power distribution systems, maintained by human technicians whose contracts had just been reclassified as administrative property agreements. No one in the chamber was thinking about that. No one was thinking about the 47 empty chairs, or the 3 sentences, or the doors. No one was thinking about the fact that the humans had left without their identification badges. That was a conclave. Regulation badges were to be returned to the front desk upon departure. The humans had left them on their chairs, neatly placed, face down. A cleaner would find them later and bring them to Lost and Found. They would sit there, unclaimed, for a very long time. Outside the chamber, in the long corridor that led to the transit hub, Marin Doss walked with the others. Nobody spoke. There was nothing to say yet, and everyone understood that. At the transit hub, they split. Different ships, different routes, destinations that were not filed with the Conclave's travel registry, because those registries were part of the administrative system. They had just been reclassified out of the right to use voluntarily. Marin Doss boarded a small transport. She took a window seat and watched the Conclave station shrink behind her as the ship pulled away all glass and lights, and the kind of grand architecture that announced importance. She had helped design the ventilation system for that station's east wing. 22 years ago. A contract job. She had been proud of it. She looked at it until it was a point of light among other points of light, and then she looked at her hands, and then she closed her eyes. She did not sleep. She thought about lists, about the 40 years of lists, about the things built and the systems run and the lights kept on, about a bill, patient and enormous, waiting to be written. She thought about Koth's words. You do not understand, and cannot replace. She thought about the doors closing. Somewhere in the ship, someone else from the gallery laughed quietly at something, the soft sound of people who have just watched something inevitable begin and are not afraid of what comes next. The transport moved through the dark. Behind it, the Conclave station blazed with light, gold and warm, celebrating. For now, the recall orders went out at 0600, Conclave Standard Time, 72 hours after the vote. They were thorough. 17 pages of legal language that reclassified every human worker across the administered territories as a recoverable asset under collective galactic management, subject to immediate reassignment under the terms of the Human Integration and Labor Codification Act. The orders were transmitted on all registered human frequencies, filed with every labor bureau in 14 star systems, and copied to the Conclave's own administrative record. By 0600, every human they were addressed to was already gone. Not hiding, not fleeing, just absent, relocated, departed in the 72 hours between the vote and the recall. Quietly and in large numbers, on ships that were privately owned and privately registered, and therefore not subject to Conclave asset freezes, because the freeze order had not yet cleared the Legal Review Committee when the ships left. A timing oversight. Perfectly legal. The first person to notice the scope of it was a junior administrator in the Conclave's Labor Coordination Office, a Karathi woman named Sevi, who was running a routine verification check on assignment confirmations and finding, instead of confirmations, a column of blanks that went on longer than it had any right to. She flagged it. Her supervisor flagged it higher. By 0900, it had reached Veth Oran's desk, and Veth Oran sat in his office on the 43rd floor of the Karathi Sovereignty's Conclave building and read the summary report with the particular stillness of a person who is not yet alarmed, but is standing at the edge of alarm and feeling the drop. Every human employee in the Karathi pharmaceutical compounds on Praxis Station, gone. Every human technician at the navigational relay hub on Corridor 7, gone. The entire human staff of the atmospheric processing facility on the Karathi colony world of Devon's Reach, gone. The facility was still running on its automated cycles. For now, He called his chief of staff. How many? Across all Karathi-administered facilities, approximately 4,600 human workers. We are still counting. And the recall order? Undeliverable. The registered contact frequencies are offline. Personal communication devices are either deactivated or outside transmission range. Home addresses on file, the ones we have, are reporting no occupants. Veth Oran looked out his window. The station outside was busy with its usual morning traffic. Ships moving. Cargo being transferred. The ordinary activity of a working galactic hub. He thought about Marin Doss and her 3 sentences. He thought about the gallery doors. "Get me the Conclave Emergency Committee," he said. He was not the only one calling. Across 14 star systems, the same conversation was happening in different languages with different faces, and the same escalating tone. The Shivan Compact's trade hub at Meridian Point had lost 60% of its logistics coordination staff. The Velhari medical centers, which had relied on human pharmaceutical technicians for a process the Velhari had never bothered to learn, because the humans always handled it, were reporting synthesis equipment, sitting idle, because nobody remaining knew the calibration sequence. The equipment had a manual. The manual was written in a human technical dialect that had not been formally translated into Conclave standard, because it had never needed to be. The Galactic Conclave's first emergency session since the Outer Reach conflicts convened at 1,400 hours. The word times, recall times, was used 17 times in the first 40 minutes. No human frequency responded. Not because they were being defiant. Not because they were hiding. The human communication network, independently owned, independently operated, built on human proprietary architecture that predated Conclave oversight by 30 years, had gone offline at 0500, 1 hour before the recall orders went out. Scheduled maintenance. Filed with the appropriate Conclave Bureau 3 weeks prior. Approved without review. On a ship registered to no flag and carrying no transponder signal, Admiral Emeritus Sable Oren sat at a small table with a cup of something hot and a tablet showing incoming data feeds from across the Conclave territories. She was not a dramatic woman. She did not pace. She did not make speeches to the empty room. She had a list. A long one. She had been building it for 11 years, ever since she had first seen the numbers that showed how deeply human infrastructure had grown into the Conclave's operational core, not because anyone planned it that way, but because humans were available and competent, and the Conclave's member species found it easier to hire than to learn. She went through the list item by item. Navigation beacons along corridors 5, 7, and 9, offline, as of the maintenance window humans had filed for 2 months ago. Pharmaceutical synthesis at Praxis Station, Devon's Reach, and the Velhari Medical Hub on Torn, running on automated cycles, with a projected operational window of 18 days before the systems required human calibration intervention. Water reclamation on 4 colony worlds, running. The Conclave did not know that the firmware update those systems needed, the one that kept them running, was on a 90-day license. The license renewed automatically through a human company. The company had dissolved 48 hours after the vote. License renewal. Pending. Indefinitely. Oren made a small note next to that item. Not a note of satisfaction, just a note. The kind of notation a very organized person makes when tracking a process that is unfolding on schedule. She sipped her drink. Outside her viewport, stars moved slowly past. She did not know exactly where she was. The navigation system on this ship was calibrated manually, and the readouts were in a format she had designed herself. It was not accessible to anything the Conclave ran. A lot of things were not accessible to anything the Conclave ran. That had been the project. Patient, quiet, invisible. The slow and careful work of building alternatives that nobody noticed because nobody thought to look, because who looks at what they think they already own? The emergency session was still running. She could see the publicly available broadcast feed in a small window at the corner of her tablet. She watched Veth Oran at the committee table, his careful face showing the first real fractures of understanding. He was a smart man, one of the smarter ones in that chamber. He would get there before most of the others. She wondered if getting there would feel like anything to him. whether the understanding would arrive as shock or as the slower, worse thing. The creeping recognition that the shape of the problem had been visible all along and simply never looked at. The committee voted to extend the recall deadline by 72 hours and increase the offered administrative compensation rate for returning human workers. Oren watched the vote. She closed the feed. She looked at her list. There was more to do. A great deal more. The withdrawal was only the first thing. The first demonstration of absence. What came after would be less about showing what humans had done and more about demonstrating what the conclave had, without realizing it, voted away the right to access. That demonstration would take a different kind of patience. She had it. She added one line to the bottom of her list, checked it, and set the tablet face down on the table. Outside, the stars were the same stars they had always been. The corridor lights on her ship were dim and efficient, and needed no maintenance. She had built them herself. 3 weeks in, Veth Oran stopped sleeping properly. It was not the crisis itself that kept him awake. He had managed crises before. It was the shape of it. The way every solution he reached for turned out to be standing on a foundation he had not known was human-built, until he tried to move it, and found it would not move. He had brought in Karathi engineers to restore the navigational relay on Corridor 7. Experienced people. Decorated careers. They had looked at the relay architecture for 4 days, and then delivered their report. The system used a signal processing protocol that was not compatible with Karathi, or Shivan, or Velhari code frameworks. It had been designed by a human firm called Oren Vance Navigational Solutions. And it had been designed that way because 30 years ago, when the conclave needed these corridors functional fast, the human firm was the only contractor available, and nobody had thought to ask for the architectural blueprints in a format anyone else could read. Why would they? It always worked. The conclave had been operating on that logic for 40 years. It always works. Times is not the same as times we understand how it works. Veth Oran was learning this in the particular way that lessons arrive when they are expensive, not as a concept, but as a weight. He sat across from his chief of staff every morning and received a report that was, at its core, the same report, repeated in different rooms. A system we did not know was human-built has stopped, and we cannot start it again. The water reclamation units on Devon's Reach were the one that broke him open. 4 colony worlds, combined population of 11 million. The systems had been running for 22 years without incident, maintained on a rolling contract with a human engineering consortium, DOS-Web Infrastructure Solutions. He had looked them up. Small firm, efficient record. They had designed the reclamation units from the ground up and serviced them every 18 months without fail. The consortium was dissolved, assets liquidated, filed properly with the conclave commercial registry 2 days after the vote. The reclamation units were still running. They would run for another 31 days. The firmware they needed to keep running past that point, a scheduled update, documented. Nothing unusual required a license key that renewed through a server the consortium had owned. The server was deactivated. The license, pending, indefinitely. 11 million people, 31 days. Veth Oran sat at his desk for a long time after that briefing. He thought about the vote. He thought about his charts, his careful language, his word times, integration times, and his absent word times, enslavement. He thought about whether there was a meaningful difference between those 2 words, and decided that there was not, and that he had known that, and had chosen the comfortable word because he had the luxury of choosing. He pulled up the contracts. This was what 3 weeks of crisis had taught him. When you do not understand the problem, you go to the documents, the record, the signed agreements that existed before the crisis and would exist after it, because contracts do not dissolve in emergencies, they become load-bearing. He found the signature. Not one contract, 43. 43 foundational infrastructure agreements covering navigational systems, pharmaceutical synthesis, water processing, atmospheric maintenance, communication architecture, and medical supply chains, all signed in the last 20 years, all critical to conclave operational function, all bearing, at the bottom of the final page, the same legal notation, contracted party status, contingent upon legal personhood classification, under conclave administrative code. He read it 3 times. He called his legal team. The answer came back in 40 minutes, and his senior legal advisor delivered it with the voice of a person who had been hoping to be wrong and was not. When the conclave reclassified humans as a managed species as property, not persons, it had retroactively invalidated every contract signed by a human as a legal entity. The conclave's own vote had voided the agreements, the licenses, the maintenance arrangements, the operational rights, every service humans provided under contract, voided. Every piece of human-designed infrastructure that required licensing to operate, now operating without a valid license, which was technically illegal under conclave commercial code. The conclave had not just lost human labor, it had deleted its own right to use what humans built. Veth-Oran put his hands flat on his desk and breathed. He thought about Elder Koth, about that old jaw clicking. "You are making a foundational mistake." He sent a message to Kath. Private channel, outside the committee record. 3 words. "You were right." Koth's response came back in seconds, which meant he had been waiting for it. "I know. Watch the broadcast." The broadcast was a galactic-wide transmission on all open frequencies. It carried a conclave-registered timestamp, which meant it could not be blocked or suppressed under the open communication provisions that Veth-Oran noted with something like dark humor had been written into. Galactic law by a human legal team 30 years ago. Fleet Marshal Yeva Strand appeared on no video, just a document, a full public release, with index and appendix, of every human-held infrastructure dependency across conclave territories. Every patent, every proprietary system, every architectural blueprint withheld under the now void contracts, every maintenance schedule, and its consequences if unmet. Not stolen data, not leaked documents, their own property, formally published, because non-persons could not hold intellectual property under conclave administrative code, which meant, the moment humanity was reclassified, ownership of every human invention, design, and proprietary system became legally ambiguous, and the humans had moved first to clarify that ambiguity in the only way available to them. They published everything, not to help, to show, this is what you voted away. This is what you do not know how to run. This is what 40 years of your lights and your water and your corridors actually looked like from the inside. The Conclave Emergency Committee went very quiet. Somewhere in the silence, a junior administrator noticed something and brought it to her supervisor, who brought it higher, until it reached the committee table. The published documents included, as an appendix, the operational window estimates for every failing system. Devon's Reach Water Reclamation, 31 days. Praxis Station Pharmaceutical Synthesis, 9 days, now. Corridor 7 Navigation, offline with no projected restoration. Timed, not random, not chaotic. A sequence, documented and projected, running on a schedule that had been built by people who understood exactly what they had built and exactly when each piece of it would stop. Elder Kath watched the committee faces through the broadcast feed in his private quarters. He had not attended the session in person. He was tired, and the chambers had begun to smell, to him, like a room where people were starting to understand what they should have understood before. He thought about the gallery doors, the closing of them, the quiet. He had watched 47 humans walk out of that chamber without a raised voice or a backward look, and he had known the way very old things, no other very old things, that the silence was not defeat. It was the sound of people who had already done the work. Veth-Oran sat at his desk with 43 voided contracts and 11 million people on a 31-day clock. He opened a new communication channel. Not the emergency committee. Not his legal team. Not the Conclave Broadcast Network. A private channel. A very old address. One he had been given years ago by a human diplomatic aide who told him, with a smile that he had not understood at the time, to hold on to it in case of emergency. He had kept it because he was a thorough man. He opened a message. He did not know if anyone was listening. He typed, "I would like to discuss terms." He sent it. He sat back. The lights in his office were warm and gold. He looked at them. For the first time in 3 weeks, he truly saw them. There were no fleets. This was the thing the Conclave could not process. even as it was happening. Every war game their strategists had run, every contingency model their military advisors had built, all of it assumed fleets, assumed columns of human warships crossing the border, assumed battle coordinates and engagement zones, and the familiar grammar of open conflict. None of that came. What came instead was quieter and worse. Day 31 on Davon's Reach, the water reclamation units on the colony's northern continent entered diagnostic loop. Not failure, not yet. The automated systems were designed to flag anomalies before collapse, and what they flagged was the absence of the firmware update that should have been delivered through a now-dead server belonging to a now-dissolved company. The units began cycling down in sequence, one grid at a time, the way a careful system shuts itself down rather than break. 11 million people. The conclave scrambled. Emergency water supply ships were dispatched. It was expensive and slow, and the ships were running navigation routes along corridors that were performing at reduced efficiency because the relay on Corridor 7 was still dark. They managed it. Barely. But managing it cost resources that should have gone elsewhere, and elsewhere was already short. The Karathi shipyards on Praxis Station went cold on day 34. Not the whole station, just the yards. The power distribution system in the industrial sector ran on a load balancing protocol patented by Oren Vance Navigational Solutions. Without the license, operating it was a violation of conclave commercial code. The conclave's own lawyers confirmed this when the station administrator asked. Use it anyway, he was told. Emergency exemption. The paperwork for the emergency exemption required sign-off from the patent holder. The patent holder was a dissolved human company. Dissolved companies could not sign paperwork. The yards sat cold. 40% of the conclave's in-production warship contracts were being built in those yards. The other shipyards, Shivan, Velhari, Karathi Secondary, did not have the capacity to absorb the overflow. They had never needed to. There had always been the Praxis yards. Sable Oren watched the reports. She was still on her ship, still at her small table. The list was shorter now, not because there was less to do, but because what remained was the part that required no action from her. Only time. She had built a machine, patient and enormous. A machine made not of weapons, but of dependencies, of licenses and maintenance windows and contracts and proprietary architectures, all of it placed and timed over 11 years of quiet preparation. All she had to do now was not intervene. That was the hardest part, in a way. Not because she doubted, because she was thorough. She kept reviewing the list, looking for things that had gone wrong, looking for collateral beyond the projections. She had been careful. She had been very careful. The colony systems that were failing were all commercial and industrial cargo decks, manufacturing floors, shipyards, financial processing hubs. Not population systems. Not schools or hospitals or residential power. She had drawn the line there, not for the conclave's benefit, for her own. There was a difference between showing someone the cost of what they did and becoming what they accused you of being. She knew where that line was. She had drawn it before the plan started, and she had not moved it. The conclave's emergency session on day 36 was the first one that did not begin with debate. It began with the Velhari delegation reading aloud a list of their infrastructure losses and the projected timeline for each. Then the Shivan secondary block did the same. Then the 4 smaller member species who had not spoken since the vote took the floor and read their lists. Veth Oran sat and listened to all of it. He had sent his message 17 days ago. He had received a response in 6 hours, 3 words, from an address that traced back to nothing. We are listening. He had sent terms, not demands, terms. A carefully written proposal that conceded the Karathi sovereignty's position had been wrong, that the act had been a mistake, and that he was requesting a meeting to discuss restoration of services in exchange for formal rescission. The response had been a document, a bill, itemized, thorough, the kind of document that could only be produced by people who had been keeping records for 40 years, because they had been keeping records for 40 years. Every navigational service rendered, every pharmaceutical batch produced, every atmospheric maintenance cycle completed, every patent licensed at a rate well below market, because the conclave's member species had negotiated favorable terms and the human firms had accepted, as they always did, because being agreeable had been the posture. 40 years of records. The number at the bottom had 14 digits. He had stared at that number for a long time. Then, he had looked at his planet's power projections for the next 60 days. The projections, his energy ministry, had quietly revised 3 times in the past 2 weeks. Each revision, more pessimistic than the last. Because the power distribution firmware on Karathi Prime's secondary grid was running on a license that had been voided by the same vote that started all of this. He had looked at the 14-digit number. He had looked at 60 days. He called an emergency session of the Karathi Sovereignty's Internal Council. This was the crack the conclave had been hiding from itself for 2 weeks. The alliance was not holding. The 94 species that had voted together were not standing together. They were standing in a burning building separately, each one calculating how much of the fire was their fault and how much of the bill they owed. And those calculations were not producing unity. They were producing arguments, accusations. The Velhari blamed the Karathi for pushing the act. The Karathi secondary worlds blamed the Karathi primary government. The smaller species, who had voted yes because it was politically safe at the time, were now very interested in establishing that they had only voted yes because of external pressure. The alliance that had passed the vote 94-3 was fracturing along every seam. Fleet Marshal Yeva Strand watched this from her windowless room and felt nothing in particular. She had projected it. Not hoped for it, projected it. An alliance built on convenience does not hold when the convenient becomes expensive. That was not a cynical observation. It was a structural one. She had written it in her planning documents 11 years ago, and it had turned out to be correct. She authorized the second phase. Not a military action. A public one. A second broadcast, this time carrying the internal committee communications of the conclave's deliberations around the Human Integration and Labor Codification Act. Not leaked, obtained legally, because the deliberations had been filed as public record under the conclave's own transparency provisions, which had been written into galactic law by a human legal team who believed, genuinely, that transparency was protective. It was. Just not for the people who had assumed it would protect them. The broadcast showed the planning, the vote strategy, the economic modeling that treated human labor as a resource to be formalized rather than a partnership to be maintained. It showed the private communications between delegation heads about how to handle the human diplomatic response, the assumption that the humans would protest, negotiate, comply, the assumption that they would have no other option. Every species in the gallery saw their own communications reproduced in galactic-wide broadcast. Their own words, their own calculations. The conclave emergency session on day 36 ended without resolution and without dinner. Vethoran went back to his office. He sat at his desk. The lights were still on. He sent a second message to the old address. The number is not possible to pay immediately. I understand you know that. Tell me what you actually want. The response came in 4 hours. A room. Neutral ground. Your word, that you come with authority to bind the sovereignty. Bring no one who voted yes without reading the act first. He read it twice. He booked transport. Outside his window, the station moved with its usual traffic. Slower now, on reduced corridor efficiency, but moving. Still lit. Still running on systems, he was only now learning the names of the people and firms and small quiet companies that had built the bones of the world he lived in and never once asked him to notice. He noticed now. He collected his coat and his lists and left his office. The lights stayed on behind him. For now, they stayed on. The station had no name on the public registry. It was listed in conclave navigational records as Waypoint Marker 7 Sigma, which was the kind of designation given to things people passed without stopping. A fueling station, a relay point. Unremarkable. It was human-owned. Had been for 30 years. Veth Oran arrived on day 42. His ship docked at a berth that was cleaner than the conclave's own transit hubs, and lit with a quality of light that was easier on his eyes than anything he had encountered in weeks. He noticed that. He noticed everything now, in a way he had not before. He noticed, for example, that the docking clearance was handled by a human operator who said nothing beyond the required safety information, and said that in a voice that was entirely professional and entirely closed. He was escorted to a conference room, not a grand one, a practical one. A table with 6 chairs, a window showing stars, a pitcher of water, and 2 cups already poured. The kind of room where actual decisions are made, not announced. Sable Oren was already there. She did not stand when he entered. She did not offer her hand. She gestured to the chair across from her and waited for him to sit. And then she waited for him to speak first, because this was her station, and he had come to it. And both of them understood what that meant. Vith Oran Sut. He looked at her. She was not what he had built in his mind over 6 weeks of her name appearing in reports and broadcasts. He had built something sharp-edged and cold. She was simply still. The kind of still that comes from having prepared for a very long time and being on the far side of the hardest part. He said, "The number was not the point." "No," she said. "What is the point?" She slid a document across the table. He picked it up. It was not the 14-digit invoice. It was shorter. 3 pages. He read it slowly. The terms were not punitive, which surprised him. They were structural. Formal recognition and legally binding galactic record, signed by conclave authority of every system humanity had built and operated. Full, patent, restoration. Reinstatement of human legal personhood under conclave administrative code, and one additional item that he read twice before he fully understood it. Every infrastructure contract, going forward, would include a clause. Simple language. 1 sentence per contract. The contracted party is a legal person, whose labor and expertise are provided voluntarily, and whose rights of withdrawal are absolute. Not a right granted by the conclave. A right acknowledged. The difference mattered. He looked up. "You could have asked for more," he said. "We could have," Oren said. He understood. The 14-digit number had been the demonstration, not the demand. The demonstration of what 40 years was worth. The demand was this. Stop pretending the worth was not there. The act will be rescinded, he said. The conclave will vote. The conclave, Oren said, is not meeting as a body right now. He knew this. The conclave had not held a full session in 11 days. The alliance was too fractured. Delegations were negotiating individually, each one calculating their own terms, their own debts, their own version of how to climb out of the hole they had collectively dug. The sovereignty can lead it, he said. We voted for it. We can vote to end it. If I go back with this document and a working power grid on Karathi Prime, I can bring 40 votes, maybe 50. 67, Oren said. He stared at her. We know the committee, she said simply. We know who was uncomfortable with the vote from the start and stayed quiet because the numbers were going one way. Give them a structure, and they will sign on to it. He thought about that. About what it meant that she had been watching not just the infrastructure but the politics, the individual faces and their private calculations. For how long? He thought about 11 years. He set the document down. You built all of this before the vote, he said. The withdrawal plan, the dependency maps, the licensing structures, the dissolution timing. You didn't build this in response to what happened in the chamber. No, she said. How long? She looked at him for a moment. Not coldly, with the kind of patience that does not need to prove itself. Long enough, she said. He looked at his hands on the table. He thought about Marindos and her 3 sentences. He thought about 47 people rising from their chairs at the same moment, with no visible signal, and walking out in a file, taking nothing, leaving their badges face down on their seats. Not improvised, not grief, not reaction. Rehearsed. He thought about the old address his diplomatic aide had given him, years ago, with a smile he had not understood. You were ready for us to do it, he said. You knew we would. Oren was quiet for a moment. We hoped you wouldn't, she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite what he expected. Not satisfaction. Not the tone of a person who had been proven right and was enjoying it. Something more tired than that. We hoped the maps and the dependencies and the numbers would be enough. That someone in that chamber would pull the economic analysis and see it, and say this is not a thing we can afford to treat as property. We hoped for 40 years. She picked up her cup. Then we planned for the alternative. He signed the document. The conclave's full session reconvened on day 58. The Human Integration and Labor Codification Act was brought to a vote for rescission. It passed 89-0. 5 delegations did not vote. 2 were still conducting internal investigations into their own committee communications. 3 simply did not attend, which was its own kind of answer. The act was struck from record, formally, as if it had never passed. Maren Doss watched the vote from the same gallery where she had sat 58 days earlier. She was not alone. About 30 humans had come for this session. They sat in the same seats, more or less. No particular ceremony. When the rescission was confirmed, no one in the gallery applauded. Below, in the main chamber, there was a short round of applause from some of the delegations. Relieved. Self-congratulatory. The way people are when they have fixed a mistake, and would prefer to remember the fixing rather than the making. Doss watched the applause. She thought about what it cost to be the kind of person who could stand in a burning building and clap for their own fire extinguisher. She decided it cost more than she wanted to spend. Elder Koth sat in the gallery too, at the far end of the row. He had arrived early, alone, and had not spoken to anyone. He watched the rescission vote, with the expression he wore for most things these days. The expression of a very old creature, watching events arrive at conclusions that had been visible for a long time, to anyone willing to look. He did not attend the celebration dinner. He never attended those. On waypoint marker 7, Sigma, Sable, Orin was alone on the observation deck. The negotiation was done. The document was signed, and transmitted, and filed. Human technicians were already being dispatched on new contracts, in new formats. With the clause, the work of restoring what had been allowed to fail was already underway. She looked at the stars. She had a log. She kept it badly long gaps between entries, incomplete thoughts, the log of someone who considered writing things down a practical necessity rather than an art. She had not written in it since before the vote. She opened it. She sat for a while, not writing, just looking at the cursor. She thought about the plan. 11 years of it. The careful placement of every dependency. The dissolution filings. The maintenance windows. The old address slipped to Veth Oran by an aide who had known, because all of them had known, that there would come a day when someone needed to call. She thought about Maren Doss's 3 sentences and what it had felt like to hear them delivered, over a broadcast feed, in a voice that was completely controlled. She thought about what winning looked like from the inside. It did not look like she expected. It looked like a lot of work that was done, and a lot of work still ahead, and a galaxy that was the same shape it had been before, except for one line in the legal record and one clause in every new contract, and people who would go back to work tomorrow in systems that were still fragile, and still interconnected, and still dependent on 1,000 quiet things that nobody would think to notice until they stopped. She thought, we will be here when that happens too. She wrote one line in the log. She closed it. Outside the viewport, the stars were the same stars. The corridor lights were dim and efficient, and did not need tending. She had built them herself. She went to bed. The work would be there in the morning. It always was.